The Ladder Out of Poverty Task Force has 6 specific tasks that are outlined on its website, and they include financial education and helping build assets. Now, a member of that task force, Senator Kathy Sheran, joins me right now to talk about their work. She's also here to talk a little bit more broadly about the issue of poverty. Thank you for joining us today, Senator.
Of course.
I want to talk to you again about the issue of poverty first. And there was recently a study released. It's a 70-page study called The Faces of Poverty 2012. And it states that between the ages of 20 and 75, more than half of the population will have experienced at least 1 year in poverty. A lot of this is situational poverty based on the recession, people losing their jobs, et cetera. But what's your impression of the growth in poverty, particularly over the last few years?
Absolutely. There's a relationship between what's happened in the mortgage foreclosures and the ability of people to sustain their assets, the equity that they've had in their homes. They've taken out loans, for example, assuming that it would continue to gain value, so that when their payments would have to increase because a contract with the bank was over and they were going to have to pay higher interest rates or increase their payments, they were unable to do that because the values of their home had fallen below what the bank said that they were willing to loan them. So they all became very challenged in terms of their ability to maintain their level of wealth. What I think that study tells us, though, where they're describing that at least 1 year in the life of people is going to be in poverty, tells us that when we're talking about poverty, we have to understand that there's quite a continuum, quite a variation of what we're talking about along a very big continuum of persons dealing with the issue of poverty. At one end of that continuum are people who struggle with severe mental illness, for example, or extreme disability that makes it difficult for them to enter fully in the workplace and create enough adequate income to pay essential costs of living. And then at the other end are seniors who are moving into retirement, and they're at that age in which they can be exploited if they don't understand adequately what they're doing, like on reverse mortgages or payday kinds of loans that are taken, and if they're not really aware of how their assets can be exploited, they can easily fall into poverty. And then in the middle are those who may have a temporary setback where their life, they've worked hard to support their family, to pay their bills, they have 2 incomes in their family, they earn just enough to stay ahead of the game, and a crisis comes along and they aren't able to sustain that. That number that you're talking about is describing that very thing, where right in the middle, where people have worked hard all their lives to maintain, assuming that things would stay the same, and then a major crisis, way out of their control, hits them, and they're not able to sustain their ongoing expenses.
And then there's also generational poverty, which is more of the cycle of poverty. People are born into it, don't know how to get out of it. I'd like to ask you what you think government's role, if any, is in trying to pull people out of poverty.
Well, I think that the government's primary role should be focused on what we need to do to make certain that we're not tipping people over into poverty. That's the first and highest responsibility, because getting out of poverty is much more difficult than it is to do the things you could do in order to support people from going into poverty. And I do think government has a significant role. It contributes in some of its policies to pushing people who are just barely making it by over that edge into poverty. And we have to take a look at what we're doing by our policies that increase the probability of people moving into poverty. Then for those who have generational poverty that you're describing, those persons who have not, maybe are new immigrants to our country, people who have not had wealthy families pass on inheritance to them so that they can start out their lives with a business or with a little nest egg to move ahead. The government also has a responsibility, first, to provide a very basic safety net, especially for children, so that those children, as they are growing, have their assets developed and their possibilities for a better future enhanced.
What role does the Ladder Out of Poverty play in all of this? There are so many different groups, different nonprofits, different government entities that are working to eradicate poverty. Where does this group fit in, and what has been done thus far?
Well, there's been a significant effort on the part of the legislature. The first step that the legislature took was to travel around the state and really take a look at what poverty means. There's a great deal of conversation about poverty, a lot of attitudes people have about poverty, a lot of blaming of poor people for being poor. So challenging assumptions people have about why people are poor, what poverty really is, and whether or not the support that the government gives to poor people really allows them or motivates them to remain poor. So the task force traveled around, took a look at those situations on the ground, challenged some of their assumptions about what exists for poverty in Minnesota and our attitudes about it. Then they put together, as you said, a series of goals or objectives of what to do to assist the state of Minnesota to address the issues of poverty, even though they have great variety and variations to them across the spectrum of poverty. And then finally, in this last piece of legislation, it's really narrowed and redefined the very specific focus of how government will try to attack poverty in the state of Minnesota by improving financial literacy and also targeting those things that we can do in people's lives, building assets that they need in order for them to be successful in terms of their economy as a family.
And part of the goal of the last meeting was to discuss recommendations to make to the next legislature, not knowing what that legislative makeup will be. What are some of those proposals? How do you move this forward?
Well, I think that we're just beginning to take a look at what some of those proposals are. We heard some testimony from various groups who are looking at ideas such as what can we do to encourage people to save money? What can we do to encourage people to think about how to set aside a little nest egg so that this kind of boundary between just holding on and falling into poverty, that there's a little nest egg or something behind them in order to prevent that. Also, there was a long discussion about how our public policies require people to spend down their assets in order to be eligible for public support or public programs. And as a public, we are interested in that, especially for families. Most families that are impoverished have children that are really experiencing the negative consequences of poverty. What can we do to help support the families retaining those assets that they need in order either to not fall into poverty or to get out of poverty, such as a reasonable automobile in order to get to work, or even a household that has some equity in it, some reasonable equity in it, that they don't have to spend down what assets they have before they can be accessing public programs. Now, why would you want to do that? Because it is that nest egg, it's that asset that helps people have the equity they need to move forward.
And we're almost out of time, but I do want to ask, with a projected $1.8 billion budget deficit in this next fiscal biennium, will there be money to support many of these public programs? And are they really going to get a close eye?
Well, I think there are some programs that are already existing that we're going to take a good look at to make sure that they're targeted towards asset building, without blaming those who are impoverished, that because you don't have these assets, that's why you're poor. But for us to acknowledge our responsibility as a government is to help to establish assets for financial future and financial success. Educational programs certainly are, and other programs like those may not have a cost associated with them at all. And those programs obviously are the ones we're going to pursue the most if there's deficits that we have to contend with. And I think most of all, we will be talking about changing the general approach we have to poverty from one of blaming poor people for their impoverished state to one of identifying how we as a government are contributing to their moving into poverty and changing those policies, and also identifying our resources towards things that will build the assets that help people either get out of poverty, but most importantly, to stay out of poverty in the first place.
And my last question for you, Senator, is President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 declared a war on poverty. Do you believe that poverty can be eradicated at all?
I think that it is a part of our condition that we will always be dealing with persons who are in poverty. I mentioned earlier in the program people who have chronic diseases like mental illnesses or other disabilities who will always need at some level some support from our community and from our tax resources. So sustaining the people's ability to avoid poverty is really where we can have the greatest impact.
Okay, Senator Kathy Sheran, thanks for the legislative impression on the task force. We certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you.